This is lecture 1.2, How Politics Impacts Policy. In this lecture, we will continue our conversation about what exactly policy is, and we will do a quick breakdown of how politics work in the United States if you're not super familiar with all that stuff. So we'll talk about the basics of politics, and we will talk about the difference between democracy, direct democracy, and representative democracy, and then we will talk about how politics impacts policy. So in our society, it is generally socially discouraged to talk about politics or religion for that matter. So if you want to maybe try to have a happy Thanksgiving or you want to go talk to your grandparents, you generally aren't going to talk about those things, right? And this is a weird social thing we have in our society. As a result of that, we often only know about our own political perspectives. And many of us do not actually know the basics of critical social issues. This isn't your fault if you're one of these people that doesn't really know much about that kind of thing. It's our education system's fault, and it's our society as a whole's fault. Part of one of the reasons why I teach is try to fill in that hole. So, and if you are knowledgeable about this sort of thing, please excuse us, but we're going to go over the real super basics of American politics. And you probably will pick up something you didn't know along the way. So we have a two-party system. It's based on the relationship between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. The Republican Party is politically conservative. We sometimes call that being right-wing. The Republican Party is also known as the GOP, which is Grand Old Party, which was a nickname given to the Republicans in the 1800s. The Republican Party stresses less intervention by the government and a focus on what it deems as traditional values. It's based on ideas of individual rights and individual justice. In general, Republicans are anti-abortion. They are pro-gun and pro-Second Amendment. They support military intervention in many instances. They are anti-taxes and anti-immigration. Now, no Republican, or many Republicans may have different values in those regard, but those are the sweeping stances of the party itself. And due to the limitations of the two-party system, there's a huge social spectrum of beliefs within the Republican Party. Individual Republicans may classify themselves as being more moderate or being more conservative, or like there's just a really wide spectrum there because about half of our population in the United States identifies as being Republican. The Democratic Party then is politically liberal or progressive. This is known as being left-wing. Again, many of us know these things, but many of us were never taught these things. Many students, I say, so can you tell me what right wing means? They don't know. But when people are real big nerds as far as politics, like me, they just assume everyone knows what right wing and left wing means. Another thing is the Democratic Party is typically associated with the color blue. The Republican Party is typically associated with the color red. The Democratic Party is also known as the DNC, which is the Democratic National Convention. The Democratic Party stresses more intervention by the government, so they believe in using government structures to get the job done, basically, and focusing on forward-thinking values. This is based on community and social responsibility. Those are the values of the Democratic Party. In general, Democrats are pro-abortion, or they pro-women's right to choose, is the way they put it. They're anti-gun. They oppose military intervention, so they don't believe in solving problems using our military. They are more in favor of taxes than Republicans are, and they're much more in favor of immigration in the modern era than Republicans are. But again, due to the limitations of the two-party system, there's a broad spectrum of beliefs within the Democratic Party. sorry, there's a typo there. That should say individual Democrats may classify themselves as being more moderate, like Hillary Clinton, or being more liberal and progressive, like people like Bernie Sanders. Now, there are some points of nuance that need to be included when talking about national politics. Parties change over time. This is actually something that a lot of many people, even within the parties, miss. So at the time of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln was affiliated with the Republican Party. He was a registered Republican. He was a Republican president. However, Lincoln's actual political views sync much more up and much more clearly with the modern Democratic Party. This is the kind of thing that people, if you don't super know your history, they just don't know, and they get very confused. But representatives of the Democratic Party were aggressively opposed to ending segregation in the South. But now the Democratic Party is much more diverse than the Republican Party. So if people are going to accuse a party of being racist, it's more common for the Republican Party to be accused of being racist than the Democratic Party. But the fact of the matter is that the Democrats in the 1940s were intensely racist. That's simply because things have shifted over time. Another point of nuance is that some leftists, so some people that call themselves Democrats or even farther left than Democrats, do not like to be called liberal. It's because they see liberal as being not left-wing enough or not being as intense in those political beliefs enough, which is really interesting because right-wing people or Republicans, whichever they classify as, when they call someone liberal, they mean that they're too intense or that they're too leftist. It's really interesting to me how that word liberal can be used by different people to mean almost opposite things. That's something as a sociologist that I just find fascinating. Sorry about that. Independent. This is another classification that people use. So people who are neither Democrats nor Republicans often classify as independent, or they classify themselves as independent. I misspoke a moment ago where I said 50% of the population classifies themselves as Republican. Surveys have actually shown that about 33% of the population calls themselves Democrat, 33% calls themselves Republican, and 33% actually call themselves independent. Most people that call themselves independent, though, aren't actually affiliated with a political party. It generally means not being affiliated with a political party, but there is a political organization that calls itself the Independent Party, but that in general is a relatively isolated kind of thing. Usually when people call themselves independents, it's because they mean that they're independent of the Democrat or Republican Party. Moderates then may be either conservatives or liberals, right? So Democrats or Republicans could call themselves moderate. Moderates typically believe in working with people of different political ideologies toward the greater good. Those who are not moderate often feel that the other side is inherently wrong or not worth working with, right? So if someone calls themselves a Democrat, but they also call themselves a moderate, they believe in working with Republicans to try to solve political issues. If someone is a Democrat that does not consider themselves moderate, that means that they don't think that the Republican Party is worth working with in any way, and that anything that a Republican would do is something that they would not want to do. And that's putting things very basically and very simply. And of course, there are certain things that you could use nuance with. Now, socialists. This is a term that has been used so much more in recent years than I never thought I'd be talking about socialists like this when I first started teaching. A socialist is a general term for people who think that business should be heavily regulated and that workers should control the means of production. That is what being socialist means. A socialist believes that workers should have a say in their workplace. And this is a term that gets confused so much. There are many small active socialist parties in the United States. These are including, but not limited to, the Democratic Socialist Party, Socialist Alternative, the Socialist Party of America, and Socialist Party USA. There are many, many, many small groups that call themselves socialist. There is no big mass socialist party like there is Democrats or Republicans, for example. The most extreme socialist groups sometimes identify as being communists. Communists may romanticize and glorify communist societies such as the Soviet Union, North Korea, or communist China. That's the big distinction there, is that communists have a more extreme political ideology. Most socialists do not, the vast majority of socialists do not consider themselves to be communists as such. And this is really something, as I said, that is developing very rapidly and very interestingly in our society that I could teach a whole course on, but I have to relegate it to just one slide. I'm sorry about that. Libertarians, then, are other people. They consider themselves socially liberal, but economically conservative. I've heard many libertarians describe themselves like that. Here are some things the libertarians are about. They believe that government should be as small as possible. They believe that there's a lot of waste in government, and government is almost inherently wasteful, and the job should be of a libertarian politician should make things as small as possible. Libertarians believe that the income tax is unconstitutional, which is a very interesting political stance. If you know anything about government and politics, the income tax fuels most of what the government does. And to do away with the income tax would certainly change a lot of government. Libertarians oppose gun restrictions like Democrats, right? I'm sorry, like Republicans, right? So Republicans really think that you should be able, most Republicans anyway, feel that you should be able to get whatever kind of gun that you could get. But libertarians also support LGBT rights rather heavily, much like Democrats do. So the Libertarian Party is very much an interesting mix of Democratic and Republican ideologies as far as third parties go. The Green Party is another third party in our society. The Green Party is closely aligned with many socialist parties. I believe at this time it is larger than most socialist parties still. It has a stronger emphasis on environmental issues than any socialist parties, though. They have been longtime supporters of marijuana legalization before the recent trend of states legalizing marijuana. The Green Party has been talking about it for a very long time. And the Green Party part in the United States is part of a greater movement of Green parties in other countries. We see a little bit of that with socialist parties as well, but the Green Party in the United States has a strong tie to international Green parties as well. So there are Greens in Israel, there are Greens in Germany, there are Greens in England, and the American Green Party has ties with those people. Other players that we need to be aware of in our society are people who call themselves alt-right, neo-Nazis, or fascists. These people, I have a little bit of a heavier carryover there. Alt-right, these are synonyms. These may also include the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK. These people believe that the smartest people and strongest people should be in charge in our society. And what determines strongest and smartest? Well, their racist ideology determines that. These definitions are almost always racist. We are aware of what the Nazis believed. In Nazi Germany, that is what they believe. They believe that certain races of white people are inherently superior to other people. Very ugly ideology. Now, when we talk about the fact that some people in society are fascists and that there are an increasing number of fascists in our society, we start to talk about, well, what does that mean regarding democracy? This is called Popper's paradox. As people who live in a democracy, we want to be able to debate fascists. We want to be able to debate the alt-right because an inherent part of democracy is being able to debate things. However, fascist ideology does not allow for proper debate because fascists believe that non-fascists are inherently inferior. And you can't debate someone who thinks that they are right, absolutely, and you are wrong, absolutely. This is why you can't debate Nazis. They don't respect you. They believe that you are inferior. And quite frankly, you shouldn't respect them because if you show them a little bit of respect, then they will try to defeat you in some way. This Popper's paradox is really the cornerstone of why we can't allow Nazi speakers on campuses, for example, which starting in the 2016 presidential campaign, this started becoming more and more of an issue. I just want to drive home to you, never to debate a Nazi. But when I say that, I need to disable that for the next slide. When I say that, that should not be applied with people just because you disagree with them, right? If you're debating someone who disagrees with you politically, you can't just call them a Nazi and say, I'm not debating with you, you're a Nazi, right? That's disrespectful to the victims of the Holocaust. It's disrespectful to our ancestors who fought in World War II to just call our political opponents Nazis just because they disagree with us. But given that there are some for real Nazis rising up in our society, if they are actually Nazis, if they are actually fascists, don't debate them because they are trying to do away with your way of life, right? And I never thought I'd be lecturing about this kind of thing, but you need to know what things are. This guy over here is clearly giving the Nazi salute. Him and his comrades are wearing black shirts, which is another sign of Nazi-dom, right? The black shirt is very traditionally associated with fascism, if you didn't know that. So yeah, he's clearly a Nazi. And if someone's clearly a Nazi, they're using the symbols of Nazis, then they are Nazis, right? Don't debate them. Now, and this is a little off-center, but consider moderate to be the absolute center, right? And over here we have the left wing, and over here we have the right wing. So we have moderates, and of moderate political parties, there are Democrats and Republicans. And the vast majority of people in our society are either Democrat or Republicans, and many Democrats and Republicans are moderates. There are some people who are Green Party on the farther left. Some people are libertarian on the farther right. And then even farther out, there are Nazis and communists on the extreme ends. That's a very simple, very basic model of how that left to right-wing ideology works. Now, here's a more interesting part that ranges from authoritarian, democratic, right? So saying only one person should be in charge to let's vote on everything, from conservative to what this chart calls radical, right? Or you could call very, very progressive, right? And then we see a more interesting layout, right? Because we see liberals being down here on the Democratic end, you would put libertarians down in this zone. A conservative is just about in the middle in terms of being conservative. A communist is up here in terms of being authoritarian and radical. So what I'm saying here is there are many ways to break down political systems besides simply being left and right. But this is generally what we're talking about. And if this is new to you, I know this is intensely confusing. So let's talk about what we mean by the difference between direct democracy and representative democracy. In the United States, citizens rely on politicians to determine public policy because legislatures or houses of representatives or senates are the sole means to pass new laws. So in all of these pink states, the only way they can get laws passed is by getting an elected official to pass that law. That is called representative democracy. Now, direct democracy statutes exist in all of these green states, and you have your key down there to break down the in-between. These green states have measures that allow individuals outside of political parties to be able to produce new policy and new legislation. So the green states are able for individuals to circumvent what the actual political parties are doing. And what does that look like? Well, again, that democracy is the term used to describe laws in 17 states that empower citizens to make law through an initiative process. And the initiative is the attempt to introduce a new law via a petition and vote among the citizenry. It's not dependent on legislator and thus able to skirt party politics. So it might be that neither the Republicans nor the Democrats like the petition you're trying to get signatures on, right, to get a new law put into place. But if you're able to get over a certain number of votes, then it has to be put on the ballot according to these initiative laws. And then if the majority of people on that vote your law in, then you get a new law. And you can circumvent both the Democrats and the Republicans. And a lot of people find that very appealing. But the process is neither inherently liberal nor conservative. It's outside of the political process, right? So, and this is something so that the political parties don't really like because it almost calls into question their very existence. And it is somewhat unpredictable. So, for example, and I'll talk about this one, then this one. California had a thing called Proposition 8 in 2008 that banned same-sex marriage. It's a very conservative stance to make in a relatively liberal place such as California, which there's a whole bunch of nuance there I'm not going to get into. So California, via these direct democracy statutes, they put through very conservative legislation. That was overruled by the Supreme Court in 2013. Same-sex marriage is no longer banned in California, but it was banned for a couple years. Now, California Proposition 64, which passed in 2016, legally recognized marijuana, almost completely on the opposite end of the political spectrum, right? From very conservative to very liberal or very progressive, right? And if you don't understand how this initiative process works, it looks like California is completely bats as far as what they will and won't pass, right? But if you understand the initiative process, then you can see a little bit better where that kind of extreme shift can come from. So let's talk a little bit more about how politics impacts policy. So conservatives or Republicans tend to favor what's called a crime control model. So a crime control model basically uses the criminal justice system to try to stop crime, right? So they say that, well, we have courts, we have cops to try to stop crime. That's why we have that. An example of conservative policy would be Arizona's SB 1070, the anti-immigration law that requires police officers to determine whether an individual is a legal citizen during a lawful stop, detention, or arrest, or any other lawful contact, in which the officer has the reasonable suspicion that a person is an illegal immigrant. That is a type of racial profiling. That's what it is. It's not calling it names to call it that, but if a cop thinks you might be an illegal immigrant And they certainly wouldn't ask a white person that looks like me if they thought that they were an illegal immigrant. They may ask them that. Now, there are certainly constitutionality questions that come in regarding this. As of right now, SB 1070 still is a law on the books. There has not been a successful challenge to it on the circuit courts or on the Supreme Court. So it is still the law. But it definitely goes toward that crime control mode of thinking that, well, the reason we have law is to stop crime. So that's why we have this thing. Now, if you take into consideration then the due process model that liberals tend to favor, liberals tend to see the protection of individual rights and individual freedoms as being of the utmost importance, right? That's the kind of policy that liberals will get behind. So the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 under the Obama administration changed the sentencing ratio between crack cocaine and powder cocaine from 1 to 18 instead of being 1 to 100. It used to be that if you had 1 gram, which is a lot, it's a lot of drugs. If you had 1 gram of crack cocaine, you would get as heavy of a sentence as 100 grams of powder cocaine. Now, crack cocaine is a little bit stronger than powder cocaine, but it's not 100 times stronger, right? So what this law did was make people's jail time less to reflect what is more fair. Might not necessarily be fair yet, but what is a more fair comparison between powder cocaine and crack cocaine, right? So this law had the impact of lessening people's jail time toward the end of greater individual rights and individual freedoms. That's the kind of policy that we would expect Democrats to pass. But that isn't always the case. Policy is not always consistent with political ideology. Sometimes liberals will adopt crime control models and conservatives will adopt due process models. This is an area where Democrats and Republicans are not absolutely politically consistent, as opposed to something like abortion or gun control, where they tend to be very politically consistent. Because criminal justice policy is not deeply embedded in platforms of political parties as other issues. So the degree of consistency is not the same, as I just said when I got ahead of myself, with abortion or gun control. So for example, Republicans almost never support abortion, right? Democrats almost never Republicans almost never support abortion. No, I have that back. I'm sorry, I have that backwards. Democrats don't. Yeah, that's right. Actually, so I'm sorry. I confused myself. That sentence is right. But they have worked together to change the way prisons work. Right. That's what I'm saying. Is the short of this before I up is that. Democrats and Republicans are sometimes willing to work with each other in this regard. And actually, considering our society, that's something we can work with, right? We can try to change the prison system because Democrats and Republicans are actually willing sometimes to make it a little better. So let's look at policy based on presidential administration. So we'll look at Democratic presidents, we'll look at Republican presidents and see how they shifted and what they looked at based on being either Republican or Democrat. So Nixon, Richard Nixon, who is accused of being a very, very criminal president. He actually was a very effective president as well, though. So he does deserve a little bit of credit. Nixon passed the Controlled Substance Act and the Juvenile Delinquency Act, both of which had the effect of putting people in jail for longer for what they considered to be possession of drugs or doing criminal things, right? That's a very crime control policy type of stuff to do. Gerald Ford, president from 74 to 77, had no major criminal justice policy at the federal level, and neither did Carter. So some presidents do a lot with criminal justice. Some presidents like Ford and Carter don't. Ronald Reagan, from 81 to 89, he was very active in terms of criminal justice policy. His Sentencing Reform Act of 1984 created a sentencing structure for federal offenses and abolished a parole on the federal level. So that had the effect of putting people in prison longer and punishing them more, right? He also created the Sex Offender Act. So that created, again, had the effect of creating more things that would be illegal to try to stop crime. It's a very criminal justice policy approach. He also is most noted for the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which enacted mandatory minimum sentences for drug possession. This was accompanied by the First Lady Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign, which really did a lot to drive home, don't do drugs, drugs are bad, always say no, and people who do drugs are criminals, right? It's a very black and white kind of image approach. And we'll talk more about how the drug war actually greatly it ballooned our prison systems. We'll talk about that more in a few weeks, and just the mess that created. So George H.W. Bush, the president after Reagan, he was Reagan's vice president, if you didn't know that, didn't have any major criminal justice policy on the federal level, which is really interesting because Bush really campaigned hard on being tough on crime, right? So one of his campaign buttons was a police badge with him and his vice president's face on it. And Dukakis was actually the Democrat running against Bush. And he was criticized heavily for his policy, which allowed prisoners to get weekend passes from prisons. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but it is what it is. That was the accusation. So by making his opponent look weak on crime, Bush was able to get elected president, even though he didn't do anything with criminal justice policy, right? But the 1990s were very much about looking tough on crime. You had to look tough on crime to be a politician in the 90s. This then carried over into the Clinton administration. And it should be noted that, again, those 1990s politics were noted as being hard on crime. The Democrats did it too. So this greatly expanded the American prison population by both Democrats and Republicans being very tough on crime. So Clinton passed the Violent Crime Control and Enforcement Act of 1994, which was the largest crime bill in history. It included provisions regarding assault weapon bans, increasing crimes that qualify for the death penalty, crimes against women, and community policing, right? So some of those are a little bit more democratically oriented. Some of these violence against women, especially community policing, probably, these are things that we would expect a Democrat to do. But crimes that qualify for the death penalty, that is not something that you expect a Democrat to get behind, right? And this wide sweeping law enforcement act, these are definitely more Republican-ish type crimes, laws. But Democrats effectively during this era in the 90s were acting just like Republicans because being tough on crime was very, very politically popular during this era. And if you weren't an adult and you're not conscious of this era, that can be really hard to understand. Now, so much of this shifted on September 11th, right? Because, and again, it's unless you were an adult at that time, it's hard to understand, but the entire national politics shifted preventing terrorism when we were attacked by a foreign entity. Everything shifted to how do we stop terrorism? So as a result of that, criminal justice laws also shifted to how do we stop terrorism, right? So the Patriot Act of 2001 expanded the power of police to gather intelligence on terrorism suspects. We also passed the Combat Methamphetamine Act of 2005 and the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act. And both of these, they sound more, maybe they do. They sound more important from a modern standpoint, but they were absolutely dwarfed in a scope compared to the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act was like one of the biggest things we talked about as a society. Terrorism was the centerpiece of what we were talking about in the early 2000s. And it really is, that was the policy that dictated that era. Now, when President Obama came into place in 2009 to 2016, he definitely took a policy stance that was more in line with what we would expect Democrats to do. He no longer took that tough on crime stance of the 1990s, but he shifted over to the more individual liberty, let's be more fair about this kind of thing, those kinds of mindsets. The Fraud Enforcement and Recovery Act enhanced criminal punishments for federal fraud laws on other white-collar crime, and this was in 2009. Remember, in 2008, we saw a lot of white-collar crime coming into place, a lot of businesses doing crime. That is distinctly different than something that we would expect from the other side. The Fair Sentencing Act of 2010, as I mentioned, changed that ratio between crack and powder cocaine. And then when we shift over to the Trump presidency from 2017, the Trump campaign has and continued to be dominated by the perceived threat of immigration, right? So it's all about viewing certain groups of people as being criminals and being able to stop criminals. So his immigration and criminal justice policies focus on detaining undocumented immigrants, on repeated pushes to build border walls, and putting people in ICE facilities, in immigration service facilities, thousands of those being children. It should be noted that non-citizens in the United States are not granted due process. So they are doing things to people that would be illegal to do to citizens. If you are a citizen of the United States, you have to be given due process. You have to be accused of doing something, and you have to be either brought up on trial or be let out after a certain amount of time. That is not something that we give to non-citizens, and it's especially troubling that we are doing that to children. But that's where we are right now. That's what's happening in terms of criminal justice policy at the moment. So we see how these shift from when a Democrat's president to when a Republican's president to when a Democrat's president, but it doesn't always shift, and it's not always perfectly lined up with the actual policy of what we would expect to be predictable among political parties. There's so much information in this presentation. Let me know if you have any questions. If you're new to politics, this could be pretty confusing. If you're not new to politics, maybe this is old hat, or maybe you still have questions. As with everything, please let me know if you have questions, and I hope to talk to you soon.